before America was strong, before it was confident, before it believed it could survive, it almost broke. Imagine a nation barely born, divided, unprepared, standing face to face with the greatest empire on earth. No seasoned army, no unity, no certainty, just fragile hope and stubborn pride. Then the war came. Cities burned. Soldiers ran. The capital itself fell to flames, and the world watched, waiting for the American experiment to fail. This is not a story of easy victory. This is the story of how a weak nation survived its first fire and learned what it would cost to exist. Stay with me, because everything you think you know about America's rise begins here. We'll explain everything in this video, step by step. Don't skip it. The war that shaped a nation before it was ready, before America stood tall on the world stage, before it spoke with the confidence of power, before it believed in its own survival. It burned, not in glory, not in triumph, but in confusion, fear, and fragile hope. This is the story of America's first true test by fire. A war fought by a nation that did not yet know what it was, or whether it would live long enough to find out. A nation born, but not united. In the late 18th century, the United States of America existed more on paper than in spirit. 13 former colonies, different cultures, different economies, different loyalties were stitched together by ink and optimism. The Constitution was young, the government was fragile, the people were divided. There was no seasoned army, no tradition of command, no shared identity strong enough to survive disaster. And yet, this newborn nation found itself standing eye to eye with the most powerful empire on earth, Great Britain. The illusion of independence. The American Revolution had ended, but peace had not truly arrived. British ships still ruled the seas. British forts still loomed near American borders. British influence still pressed into American trade, American politics, and American pride. To Britain, the United States was not an equal. It was an experiment that would eventually fail, and for years, America tolerated the insults. Sailors were dragged from American ships and forced into British service. Trade was strangled frontier. Settlements burned as native tribes, armed and encouraged by British agents, fought to hold their land. America was independent, but treated like a child who had wandered too far from home. The decision no one was ready for. By 1812, patience had thinned. In Washington, young politicians spoke of honor, sovereignty, and destiny. They believed a short war would force Britain to respect America or even surrender Canada. It was a dangerous fantasy. The United States declared war without a professional army, without unified public support, without the infrastructure to sustain a prolonged fight. Farmers marched alongside lawyers. Teenagers stood beside aging veterans of a war fought decades earlier. Many had never fired a weapon. America was about to learn the cost of being unprepared. The first shocks of reality. The war began not with glory, but with embarrassment. American invasions of Canada collapsed almost immediately. Poor leadership, low morale, and inexperienced troops turned ambition into retreat. Militia units refused to cross borders. Generals argued instead of commanding. Supplies vanished. British regulars, hardened by years of war against Napoleon, exposed every weakness America tried to hide. For the first time, Americans questioned whether independence had been a mistake. The night the Capitol burned, then came the moment that seared itself into national memory. August 1814, British forces marched into Washington, D.C., the heart of American government, the symbol of a nation's promise. The defense collapsed, and as night fell, the flames rose. The Capitol burned, the president's house burned, the libraries, halls, and chambers of a young republic were reduced to ash. From across the river, Americans watched their capital glow red against the sky. This was not just a military defeat, it was humiliation. The world was watching, and America looked weak. Ordinary people, extraordinary resolve. But history does not turn only on generals or governments. It turns on people, on sailors who fought British frigates with outdated ships, but unbreakable resolve, on frontier families who defended their homes with little more than faith and muskets, on enslaved people who fled to British lines seeking freedom, and on those who fought hoping liberty might someday reach them too. The war forced Americans to confront their contradictions. A nation built on freedom, yet divided by slavery, a republic claiming unity, yet fractured by class, region, and race. The fire exposed the truth, but it also forged something new. The battle that changed everything. January 1815, New Orleans. The war was technically already over, but no one there knew it. What followed was not a tactical miracle, but a psychological transformation. American forces, farmers, frontiersmen, free black soldiers, immigrants, stood together behind makeshift defenses. Against them marched seasoned British troops, and they failed decisively. The victory at New Orleans did not win the war, but it won America's belief in itself. For the first time, Americans did not feel lucky. They felt capable. Peace without victory, but with meaning. The Treaty of Ghent ended the war without territorial gain. No clear winner, no dramatic surrender. On paper, it changed little. But beneath the ink, everything was different. America had survived invasion, survived humiliation, survived itself. The war forced the nation to build a real military, to strengthen its institutions, to recognize that independence had to be defended, not declared once and assumed forever. The legacy of fire. America's first taste of war was not heroic. It was messy, painful, humbling, but it did something no document ever could. It taught a nation what survival costs. From the ashes of burned buildings and broken illusions, a harder, wiser republic emerged, still flawed, still divided, but no longer naive. This was the war that America fought before it was ready, and because it survived, it would never face the world the same way again. In the years after independence, the United States existed in a strange and uneasy space between birth and maturity. It called itself a nation, yet it lacked the muscle memory of one. Its borders were uncertain, its authority fragile, its unity more imagined than real. On maps, the country stretched confidently across the continent's edge, but in reality, it was thin, nervous, and exposed. The people living within it did not yet think of themselves as Americans first. They were Virginians, New Yorkers, New Englanders, frontiersmen, merchants, farmers. Independence had freed them from Britain, but it had not yet bound them to each other. Across the Atlantic stood Great Britain, bruised but undefeated, seasoned by decades of global war. It was an empire that had learned how to fight on oceans and continents, how to lose colonies and still dominate the world. To British leaders, the United States was not a rival power. It was a former possession that had slipped away during a moment of distraction. Many in London believed it would eventually drift back into dependency, weakened by internal division and economic necessity. The idea that this loose collection of former colonies could stand as an equal seemed almost laughable. This imbalance defined everything. Britain commanded the seas with the most powerful navy on earth. Its ships moved like steel shadows across trade routes, enforcing blockades, searching vessels, taking sailors. American commerce depended on the ocean, yet America could not protect it. When British officers boarded American ships and dragged men away in the name of impressment, the young republic protested with words, not force. Each sea's sailor was a reminder that independence was still theoretical, that sovereignty without power was fragile. Inside the United States, the arguments never stopped. Some believe the nation should avoid conflict at all costs, that another war with Britain would shatter what little stability existed. Others saw continued submission as a slow death, a quiet return to colonial status under a different name. The government itself was an experiment still under construction. The Constitution was barely a generation old. Federal authority was weak, often challenged by states that guarded their rights more fiercely than any shared national purpose. There was no professional army worthy of the name. What existed was scattered, underfunded, and inexperienced. Militias were made up of men who trained occasionally, if at all, and who often felt more loyalty to their local communities than to distant national leaders. Officers were chosen as much for political connections as for competence. Supplies were inconsistent, discipline uneven. Against a global empire, this was not a defense, it was a gamble. Yet pressure kept building. British support for Native American resistance along the frontier intensified violence in border regions. Settlers saw their homes attacked and believed Britain was orchestrating their suffering. In Congress, younger politicians spoke with fire and confidence, convinced that national honor demanded action. They argued that America would never be respected unless it proved it could fight. They underestimated the enemy, overestimated themselves, and misunderstood what war would demand from a society still learning how to govern itself. For Britain, the conflict barely registered as an existential concern. Its primary focus remained Europe, where wars against Napoleon consumed vast resources and attention. The American theater was secondary, a distraction handled by seasoned officers and surplus forces. This difference in perspective was crucial. One side saw the coming conflict as a defining struggle for survival and legitimacy. The other saw it as a manageable problem on the edge of empire. This asymmetry shaped the early stages of confrontation. Britain could afford mistakes. America could not. Every loss struck deeper, echoed louder. Each failed expedition or retreat fed doubts about whether the Republic had overreached. Foreign observers watched closely, measuring whether this experiment in self-rule could endure pressure or would collapse under it. The psychological weight of facing Britain was immense. Memories of colonial rule were still fresh, passed down through lived experience rather than history books. The empire represented not just military strength, but a reminder of past dependence. To challenge it was to reopen old wounds and test whether the separation achieved through revolution had truly taken hold. Many Americans feared that defeat would not simply mean loss of territory or prestige, but the unraveling of the entire national project. At the same time, there was a strange confidence born of ideology, the belief that a free people fighting for their own future possessed an inherent advantage over professional soldiers was deeply rooted. It had been true once during the Revolution, but circumstances had changed. Britain had learned from that loss. America, meanwhile, had grown comfortable in peace without developing the institutions needed to protect it. The fragile nation stood at a crossroads, pulled between caution and defiance. Its leaders spoke the language of equality and rights while negotiating from a position of weakness. Its people demanded respect, but were unsure what sacrifices they were willing to make to earn it. The gap between ideals and capabilities widened with each passing year until conflict became not just possible, but inevitable. When war finally came, it was not the result of a single outrage or decision, but the culmination of unresolved tensions between a rising republic and a declining empire that still possessed overwhelming power. One side was fighting to be acknowledged as real. The other was fighting to maintain order in a world it no longer fully controlled. The collision was unavoidable, and when it came, it exposed how thin the line was between independence declared and independence defended, how easy it was for a nation to exist in theory, and how hard it was to survive in reality, standing alone against a global empire that had shaped the modern world and was not yet ready to accept that its former colony might do the same. When war arrived, it did not meet a nation standing at attention. It found a country still arguing with itself, still unsure whether conflict was a necessary step or a reckless mistake. The declaration of war did not create unity overnight. In many towns, church bells did not ring. In some states, flags were not raised. Large sections of the population opposed the conflict, especially in regions whose livelihoods depended on trade with Britain. For them, war threatened not honor, but survival. The United States entered the fight without the machinery required to sustain it. There was no national system capable of rapidly training, equipping, and transporting soldiers. Weapons were scarce and often outdated. Uniforms, when they existed at all, varied widely, making American forces appear disorganized even before the first shots were fired. Many soldiers arrived at camps with their ow as proof that the nation had acted foolishly. Supporters insisted that setbacks were temporary and blamed individual commanders rather than systemic weakness. The government struggled to respond, lacking both experience and resources. Financing the war was itself a challenge. Taxation was unpopular, borrowing was difficult, and the national economy strained under blockades and disrupted trade. On the seas, the imbalance was even more stark. Britain's navy dominated the world's oceans, while the United States possessed only a handful of warships. American sailors fought with skill and courage, winning several dramatic single-ship engagements, but these victories were symbolic rather than strategic. British blockades tightened, choking ports and crippling commerce. Coastal towns lived with the constant fear of attack, while merchants watched fortunes disappear. For ordinary people, the war was felt less as a patriotic crusade and more as a steady erosion of stability. Prices rose. Goods became scarce. Families worried about sons who marched off with little training and uncertain prospects of return. In some regions, enlistment quotas sparked resentment rather than enthusiasm. Communities divided along political lines, with neighbors arguing over loyalty and responsibility. The gap between rhetoric and reality grew impossible to ignore. Speeches spoke of honor and sovereignty, but the battlefield told a different story. Units broke under pressure. Forts surrendered without serious resistance. Campaigns ended before they truly began. Each disappointment reinforced the sense that the nation had rushed into a conflict it did not fully understand, yet necessity forced adaptat. Ion. Defeat exposed weaknesses that could no longer be denied. Slowly, painfully, the United States began to learn. Training improved in some units. Younger officers gained experience and confidence. Supply systems, though still flawed, became more organized. The war became a harsh classroom, teaching lessons through loss rather than theory. Still, the cost was heavy. Lives were spent correcting mistakes that preparation might have prevented. The emotional toll weighed on a population already uncertain about the war's purpose. Many Americans began to realize that independence did not guarantee security. Declaring sovereignty was easier than defending it. The nation had assumed that courage and principle would compensate for lack of readiness, but war demanded more than belief. As the conflict dragged on, the initial enthusiasm of its advocates faded into grim endurance. What had been imagined as a brief assertion of national strength became a prolonged struggle marked by frustration and doubt. The United States continued to fight not because it was fully prepared, but because retreat seemed worse than persistence. To stop would have meant accepting weakness as permanent. The war exposed a truth that could not be ignored. A nation unwilling to invest in its own defense would always be at the mercy of stronger powers. The United States was learning this lesson in real time under fire, without the luxury of delay or retreat. Every battle, whether lost or narrowly won, reinforced the same reality, that the country was being forced to grow up in the harshest way possible, compelled to confront the gap between what it wanted to be and what it actually was, struggling forward. Without certainty, driven by pride, fear, and the stubborn refusal to surrender an independence that had been declared before the tools to protect it truly existed. The war reached its darkest meaning when defeat stopped being abstract and became personal. Losses on distant frontiers were painful, but they could still be explained away as mistakes or bad luck. What followed could not. When British forces turned their attention toward the American coast, the war moved from the edges of the Republic to its very center. It was no longer a test of policy or ambition. It became a test of survival, dignity, and credibility. By 1814, Britain was no longer distracted. The long struggle against Napoleon in Europe was ending, and seasoned troops were now available for deployment elsewhere. Ships that had once guarded the English Channel crossed the Atlantic. Veterans who had fought in Spain and across Europe stepped onto American soil. They were disciplined, confident, and supported by the strongest navy in the world. The imbalance that had always existed now became overwhelming. American defenses along the coast were weak and scattered. Fortifications were incomplete. Command structures were confused. Intelligence was poor. Even as British forces prepared to strike, American leaders argued over where the real threat lay. Some believed New York would be the target. Others feared Baltimore. Washington, the capital itself, was considered unlikely, almost unthinkable. It was a city of symbols more than strength, lightly defended and barely finished, but its political importance made its vulnerability difficult to accept. When British troops landed in Maryland, the response was caw, tick. Militia units gathered slowly, many poorly trained and inadequately supplied. Officers disagreed over strategy. Orders were delayed or ignored. As British columns advanced inland, American forces met them at Bladensburg. The battle should have been a chance to slow the enemy, to buy time. Instead, it became a collapse. Under pressure, American lines broke. Militia units fled. Some fired only a few shots before retreating. The defense dissolved into confusion and panic. British troops pushed forward with methodical confidence, scarcely believing how easily resistance melted away. The road to Washington lay open. Inside the Capitol, fear spread quickly. Government officials scrambled to evacuate. Records were packed hurriedly. The president fled. Civilians watched as soldiers abandoned positions and rumors raced through the streets. The idea that the capital of the United States could fall seemed impossible, and yet there was no force left to stop it. When British troops entered Washington, they encountered a city that symbolized ambition more than achievement. Public buildings stood unfinished. Streets were wide but sparsely populated. This was not London or Paris, but it was the heart of a republic that claimed equality with empires. What happened next was deliberate and devastating. The British did not loot indiscriminately. They targeted symbols. The Capitol was set ablaze, its wooden interiors feeding the fire. The president's house burned, flames lighting the night sky. Government offices followed. Smoke rose above the city, visible for miles. The destruction was controlled, purposeful, and humiliating. For Americans watching from a distance, the sight was unbearable. This was not simply the loss of buildings, it was the shattering of an image. The republic that had declared itself sovereign was unable to protect its own seat of power. The message to the world was unmistakable. The United States could be struck at will. The psychological impact was immense. Newspapers struggled to describe the event without despair. Critics of the war felt vindicated. Supporters were forced into silence. Ordinary citizens questioned whether the nation had overestimated itself. The memory of colonial subordination returned with force. For some, it felt as though independence itself had gone up in flames, yet humiliation did not end with the burning of Washington. Along the coast, British raids continued. Towns were shelled, ships were seized, trade was strangled. The blockade tightened, pressing hardship into daily life. Farmers could not sell their crops. Merchants faced ruin. Coastal populations lived in constant anxiety, unsure when British sails might appear on the horizon. The war now felt intimate. It reached into homes and communities. It exposed the cost of weakness in ways that speeches never could. For enslaved people, the chaos opened dangerous possibilities. Many fled to British lines, seeking freedom promised or implied. Their actions challenged the nation's claims about liberty and revealed contradictions that war had sharpened rather than resolved. The government, embarrassed and alarmed, struggled to respond. Rebuilding morale proved harder than rebuilding walls. Confidence once lost was not easily restored. Even as defenses improved elsewhere, the memory of the Capitol burning lingered. It became a wound in the national psyche, a reminder of how close the Republic had come to collapse. Foreign observers took note. European powers watched carefully, assessing whether the American experiment could survive pressure. Some saw the burning of Washington as proof that the United States was a temporary phenomenon destined to fracture or fall back into dependence. Recognition and respect were delayed, withheld, conditional. For the soldiers who had fled at Bladensburg, the shame was personal. For leaders who had failed to prepare, it was political. For citizens, it was collective. The war was no longer about abstract rights or distant insults. It was about restoring something that had been taken, credibility. Out of humiliation grew resolve, but it was a bitter kind. Pride alone could not erase the images of smoke and fire. Lessons had been learned at terrible cost. The nation understood now that ideals did not intimidate enemies, that declarations meant little without force to support them. Survival required competence, coordination, and sacrifice. The burning of Washington became a turning point not because it changed the course of the war immediately, but because it changed how Americans understood themselves. Innocence was lost. Assumptions were destroyed. The belief that geography or moral righteousness could shield the Republic evaporated. The world had proven willing to strike at the heart, and the heart had proven vulnerable, leaving behind a scar that would shape decisions, defenses, and fears for generations, a memory of fire and failure that refused to fade, reminding a young nation that humiliation was not theoretical, that weakness invited violence, and that survival demanded transformation under the harsh glare of global power, where symbols mattered as much as armies, and the cost of being unprepared was written in ash and smoke across the capital of a republic, still struggling to prove it deserved to endure. The war was not carried on the shoulders of generals alone. It lived and breathed through ordinary people, pulled into a conflict they neither designed nor fully understood. While politicians debated honor and strategy, farmers left their fields untended, craftsmen closed their shops, and sailors signed on to ships, knowing the sea itself might become their grave. The war reached into everyday life and transformed people who had never imagined themselves as part of history into its unwilling participants. Most soldiers who marched were not professionals. They were young men with calloused hands and uncertain futures, drawn from villages, farms, and city streets. Many had grown up hearing stories of the revolution, tales that made war sound purposeful and heroic. What they encountered instead was boredom, hunger, confusion, and fear. Camps were plagued by disease long before battles arrived. Poor sanitation and limited medical knowledge meant that sickness killed as many men as enemy fire. Letters home spoke of longing and doubt more often than courage. For militia members, service was deeply personal. They fought to protect familiar ground, not abstract borders. When called beyond their local regions, their commitment wavered. Some deserted quietly, believing their responsibility ended with the defense of their own communities. Others stayed, bound by loyalty to friends rather than the flag. Units formed around shared origins, neighbors hiding side by side, which strengthened bonds but also deepened grief when losses came. On the seas, sailors faced a different kind of war, American naval crews were outmatched in numbers and resources, yet they fought with stubborn determination. Life aboard ship was harsh even in peace, but wartime multiplied the danger. Storms, enemy cannon fire, and the constant risk of capture defined their existence. British impressment haunted every voyage. The fear of being taken, forced into service under a foreign flag, lingered in every port and along every trade route. Women carried burdens rarely acknowledged. With men gone, they managed farms, businesses, and households under strain. Shortages forced ingenuity. Letters became lifelines, often delayed or lost, leaving families suspended between hope and dread. In coastal towns, women and children fled inland as British ships appeared offshore, carrying what they could, abandoning homes to uncertainty. Their endurance kept communities alive while the war disrupted every routine. For enslaved people, the conflict opened dangerous and complex paths. British forces offered freedom to those who escaped bondage and reached their lines. Thousands risked everything to flee plantations, guided by rumor and desperation. Some succeeded finding new lives beyond American control. Others were captured, punished, or killed. Their choices exposed the contradiction at the heart of the Republic, a nation fighting for sovereignty while denying freedom to so many within its borders. Free Black Americans also played crucial roles, serving as soldiers, sailors, laborers, and defenders of key positions. They fought for a country that did not fully recognize them, hoping service might earn rights long denied. In places like New Orleans, Black troops stood in defense of the nation, their presence both essential and contested. Their courage challenged assumptions, even as discrimination persisted before, during, and after the war. Native American communities faced devastation. Caught between expanding American settlement and British strategic interests, many tribes were drawn into the conflict as allies, protectors of their land, or targets of retaliation. Villages were destroyed, food supplies disrupted, and populations displaced. For them, the war was not about national pride, but survival. Promises made by both sides often vanished once fighting ended, leaving lasting loss in the war's wake. Immigrants, particularly recent arrivals, also found themselves entangled. Some enlisted to prove loyalty to their new home. Others worked in shipyards, factories, and ports, sustaining the war effort without recognition. The conflict accelerated the blending of identities, forcing people from different backgrounds to cooperate under pressure, even as suspicion and prejudice remained. Civilians endured the slow grind of economic hardship. Blockades choked trade, causing unemployment and scarcity. Prices rose, wages fell, and resentment grew. In some regions, opposition to the war became open defiance. Protests erupted. Newspapers attacked the government. The idea of national unity fractured under stress, revealing how thin the sense of shared purpose truly was. Yet, amid hardship, moments of quiet resilience emerged. Communities organized to support soldiers' families. Churches and local groups gathered supplies. Neighbors helped neighbors, driven less by patriotism than by necessity and shared hardship. These small acts sustained morale when official leadership faltered. The war demanded sacrifices that rarely aligned with rewards. Veterans returned home with injuries, trauma, and little compensation. Some struggled to reintegrate into civilian life, carrying memories they could not easily share. Their service did not guarantee prosperity or honor. Many faded back into anonymity, their contributions absorbed into a larger national narrative that often overlooked individual suffering. Through these ordinary lives, the war took shape. It was experienced not as a single story, but as thousands of overlapping struggles, each shaped by circumstance, identity, and chance. The outcome mattered less in daily life than the immediate realities of survival, loss, and endurance. The nation's fate was decided not only in battles and treaties, but in kitchens, fields, ships, and camps where people adapted, endured, and pressed forward without certainty, bound together by circumstances they did not choose, revealing that the true weight of war was carried far from the halls of power, resting instead on the backs of those who lived through it, shaping a society through shared hardship, unresolved contradictions, and the quiet strength of individuals who became extraordinary not by ambition, but by necessity under pressure that refused to relent. By the time the war approached its final stages, something within the United States had shifted. The early illusions were gone, burned away by failure and humiliation. What remained was not confidence, but determination shaped by experience. The nation no longer imagined war as a test it could pass through enthusiasm alone. It understood now that survival required endurance, learning, and adaptation, and that belief in ideals had to be matched by the ability to defend them. The transformation did not happen all at once. It emerged unevenly through trial and error. Officers who had failed were replaced or forced to improve. Soldiers who had once scattered learned painfully how to hold their ground. Training became stricter in some units, discipline harsher, expectations clearer. The Army remained imperfect, but it was no longer entirely untested. Each engagement, whether successful or not, added to a growing body of experience that could not be erased. On the seas, American sailors continued to fight against overwhelming odds. While blockades tightened and ports suffered, naval crews adapted their tactics, choosing engagements carefully, striking when advantage favored them. Victories, though limited in scope, carried enormous symbolic weight. They proved that skill and resolve could challenge superiority, that the empire was not invincible. These moments traveled quickly through newspapers and taverns, lifting morale and reshaping how Americans saw themselves. The defense of key cities reflected this growing resolve. Baltimore, targeted after the burning of Washington, did not collapse in panic. Fortifications were strengthened. Troops prepared with urgency. Civilians participated, digging, supplying, watching. When the British attacked, they encountered resistance that had not existed months earlier. The city held. The flag remained. The survival of Baltimore did more than protect a port. It restored belief that humiliation was not destiny. Nowhere was this change more visible than in the Gulf South. The defense of New Orleans brought together a force unlike any the nation had fielded before. Frontiersmen, regular soldiers, free black troops, enslaved laborers, immigrants, and local militias stood side by side. They were bound not by uniform background or shared ideology, but by the immediate necessity of defense. Leadership was decisive, preparations relentless. The victory that followed was not simply a battlefield success, it was a psychological reversal. Although the war was already nearing its diplomatic end, the battle at New Orleans reshaped memory. It offered a narrative Americans could hold on to, one of unity under pressure and competence earned through hardship. It did not erase earlier failures, but it reframed them as part of a learning process rather than proof of national inadequacy. The nation began to see itself not as a fragile experiment teetering on collapse, but as a community capable of growth under stress. When peace arrived, it did so quietly. There was no triumphant march, no conquered territory to display. The treaty restored boundaries and resolved little on paper. Yet the absence of defeat mattered deeply. The United States had endured invasion, blockade, internal division, and economic strain without disintegrating. For a young republic, survival itself was a form of victory. In the aftermath, changes followed. Military institutions were re-examined. Coastal defenses expanded. The importance of a standing army and navy gained broader acceptance. Political divisions did not vanish, but the idea that the nation could not defend itself lost credibility. Americans became more cautious, but also more self-assured, aware of their vulnerabilities without being paralyzed by them. Internationally, perceptions shifted. European powers began to treat the United States with increased seriousness, It was no longer merely a former colony with ambitions beyond its capacity. It was a state that had resisted one of the world's dominant empires and remained intact. Respect was not immediate or unconditional, but it grew steadily, grounded in demonstrated resilience rather than revolutionary rhetoric. Domestically, the war influenced identity in subtle ways. Regional loyalties persisted, but a broader sense of shared experience emerged. The conflict had touched nearly every community, creating a common memory of hardship. Songs, stories, and commemorations began to circulate, shaping how future generations would understand the nation's early struggles. The idea of being American acquired deeper meaning, tied not just to independence won, but to independence preserved. The war also left unresolved tensions. Economic disparities remained. The contradiction of slavery grew sharper, highlighted by the participation and sacrifices of Black Americans whose rights were still denied. Native nations continued to face displacement and broken promises. These issues did not disappear with peace. They hardened, becoming defining challenges of the nation's future. Yet the war changed how conflict itself was understood. Americans learned that isolation did not guarantee safety, that oceans could be crossed. Capitals, thank you for listening, and don't forget to like and subscribe.